With our special guest tonight, Edward Haslam, as we talk about his work, Dr. Mary's Monkey, fascinating story. And wait till we get into some of this other stuff with it. Unbelievable. And welcome back to Coast. We're with Ed Haslam as we talk about this incredible story that he has condensed into his book, Dr. Mary's Monkey. Let's talk about point number 2 here, where you talk about an epidemic of soft tissue cancer. What is that?
Well, before the break, I was talking about this book, The Health Century, where Edward Shorter wrote about Bernice Eddy, who is the scientist who was working with Sarah Stewart when they discovered the cancer-causing virus. Well, Bernice Eddy went public with her information as best she could. She went to the Cancer Society meeting up in New York and announced that they had found a cancer-causing virus in the cells upon which the vaccine had been grown. She stopped short of saying it was in the vaccine, but she wanted to get her medical professionals looking into it, which some of them started to do. And we find up in Philadelphia, Maurice Hilleman, who was the head vaccine developer for Merck, became very tuned into this. In fact, I have a video of him on my website. I've got several hours worth of video on my website, drmarysmonkey.com, but you've got to spell out doctor. And Maurice Hilleman says very clearly that he found a cancer-causing virus in the polio vaccine. And he went to Albert Sabin, who was the developer of the sugar cube vaccine, as we know, and said, Albert, there's cancer in your vaccine. And so the insiders at NIH knew this way back in about 1958 or 59. So the question we need to get to here is, what did they do once they realized that they had already released 100 million doses of a contaminated vaccine, contaminated with a cancer-causing virus, and they still had another 100 million on the shelf. And for your listeners who aren't going to be able to stay with us for the next 4 hours or next 3 hours, I want to make sure they can get this book if they want to. We have a very convenient 800 number, which is 556-2012, just the famous 2012 year. And there are operators standing by there that can take your order now, or you can get it from my website or from Amazon.com. Now, what we have here is, when I heard about Bernice Eddy's announcement, I said, wait a second, she's trying to tell us something.
Mm-hmm.
Is she trying to tell us that there's an epidemic of cancer coming? And did it ever get here? And if it did, why didn't the press tell us? And so I went to a medical library, and I went and got together with the librarian. I said, this is what I need to know. And she came back with a book of NCI statistics. And she said, it's on this page right here. And it was 16 years of every cancer that they had tracked. I went home and put it on my computer, and the graphs are in my book. And what we see is a massive epidemic of soft tissue cancers that erupts in the years following the polio vaccine. And by soft tissue, I'm referring to breast as a soft tissue, prostate, lymphoma, and melanoma, which is cancer of the skin. If the quid pro quo here, if the connection between the polio vaccine and this cancer epidemic is, as I suspect, which is causal, then we got back 15 cases of cancer for every one case of polio on an annualized basis.
Now, how many people were vaccinated, and at what point did this vaccination stop with the contaminated monkey virus in it?
Well, the really saddest part of this entire story is they knew what was going on in 1960. Certainly by 1961, they still had another 100 million doses on the shelf. And the problem was they didn't want to stand up in front of the congregation and say, we got bad news. We just gave 100 million people a cancer-causing virus. They kept it secret, and they continued knowingly to distribute a contaminated vaccine for all of 1961, 62, and 63.
Oh, my God.
the total number, according to the Boston Globe, where somebody did write a very nice article on this, is about 198 million. So we're just at about the 200 million that they could document that actually got the contaminated vaccine. The problem is it's sexually transferable. So we're talking about not only everybody that got the polio vaccine between 1955 and 1963, but everybody that ever had sex with any of them.
You are saying that this virus that could cause cancer is also sexually transmittable.
Right. The Italian research on this is interesting because they found the SV40 virus, which is the one we're talking about here, in the semen of otherwise of 55% of the otherwise healthy Italian males.
Now, what percent of the people that have the virus in their system do you think come down with cancer?
It's about 1 in 200. It's the same ratio as occurs with the human papilloma virus. They've nailed this one down very good. They say 100% of cervical cancer is caused by HPV, but only 1 out of every 200 get the cancer.
Okay.
Well, that's 0.5% of 1%. There's 300 million people here in the United States. 0.5% of 1% is 1.5 million cases of cancer a year, and that's what we've got.
This is amazing. All right, so that's the second point here.
And you want to put some dollars on that in terms of treatment? You want to see what $50 billion a year looks like?
You stack it up. It's pretty high. All right, that's your second point. Now, let's get back to this monkey virus itself. How did it get contaminated, Ed?
Well, the polio vaccine had to be grown on something, and it likes monkey kidney cells. So they cut out the kidneys of these rhesus monkeys, ground them up, put them in petri dishes, and grew the polio virus in there in order to make the vaccine. And in order to really follow this, I got to get into a little bit of detail about the polio vaccine itself. The names Salk and Sabin are in most people's memory. Now, Salk was the first guy, and he said, look, there's 3 flavors of polio. There's heavy, medium, and light, okay? And the only one that really kills and cripples is heavy. So what we're going to do is we're going to kill the heavy one. We're going to drown it in formaldehyde, and we're going to use that dead virus to trigger people's immune system. And so that is called the inactivated or dead virus vaccine, and that was what was launched in April of 1955.
All right.
And it
now, I was born in 1950. What do I have? What's in me?
Probably the next one, but let me finish up with this part of the story because this is really important link here. There were 6 laboratories producing this Salk vaccine, and they had a big press conference up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, about the Francis trials that said this thing was safe. And so they told the entire American public, this thing is safe. Roll up your sleeves, get ready. Here comes the polio vaccine.
Yeah. Line up, folks. Right?
Line up. And at that point, they turned around and they handed it to Bernice Eddy, who was the official vaccine safety tester for the National Institute of Health, and said, approve this. And she took it and injected it into her monkeys, and she got back dead and crippled monkeys. And she took photos of it and said, if you release this, you're going to kill children. Okay? So you ought to delay this thing until we can figure out what the problem is. And they said, are you nuts? We've already told the public it's safe. We can't tell them there's a problem with it at this point. And they called Dr. Oshner down in New Orleans. Now, Dr. Oshner happens to be like one of the major stockholders, if not the major stockholder of the Cutter Laboratories that's producing the vaccine.
Oh, geez.
And they said,
sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Doc, we got a problem here, and it's not with the other 5 labs, it's with Cutter, okay? And we need you to withdraw your vaccine quietly. And he said, I'm not doing that. He said, this vaccine's safe. I've known Jonas Salk for 20 years. I've been following this thing every step of the way. And so what he does, he's head of surgery at Tulane Medical School in New Orleans.
Did he actually believe that it was safe? Or what was he just saying?
What is actually belief? He calls the entire faculty of Tulane Medical School together in an amphitheater and brings in his own grandson and granddaughter and says,
no.
I would never ask you to do anything I would not do. Here, I'm going to inoculate my kids right here, right now. And within 48 hours, his grandson was dead, and his granddaughter had polio.
Oh, my God. All right, what was the fallout after that with him?
Well, the first thing they did was they withdrew the Salk vaccine. Salk lived out his life on the bluffs of Santa Barbara. He's got the greatest PR organization in the world. And he got an award from President Eisenhower on the lawn of the White House. But people forget that his vaccine backfired on launch and was withdrawn. And what they did, they turned to another vaccine developer, Albert Sabin, and they said, what would you do? And he said, well, you got these three flavors, heavy, medium, and light. Just use light, because it really doesn't do anything except give you like flu-like symptoms, and it doesn't kill or maim. So they deliberately left polio light alive. It's called the live virus vaccine. In the polio vaccine, they grew it on monkey kidney cells, and they started out injecting it with a syringe into the veins. And after a while, they figured out they could just put a couple of drops of monkey viruses into a sugar cube. And you, to answer your question, probably got the sugar cube just because of your age.
Probably did, if I remember.
The little white cups stacked up on the school cafeteria tables where we were all. In fact, I remember standing in line with those little white cups and the sugar cubes in there, and I saw the kids in line, and I'm in New Orleans at the time, pocket the sugar cube. And I said, what are you doing? He said, it's all full of monkey pus. I'm not taking that thing.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about Bernice Eddy. So she says, don't give this out. Don't do this. Did she have any clout to stop it?
No, because the people, she March of Dimes, and there was like a media hysteria about polio. And it was, polio is a bad disease, and they had the iron lungs and all this other stuff going on, and there were about 35,000 cases a year. That translates to 125 kids a day getting polio. So there was a lot of urgency on this.
Proponents of the vaccine still say that it eradicated polio. Not true?
I'm going to leave that to others. I've read a lot of stuff that said the disease was on the decline in the first place.
And would have gone away by itself.
Right, and I have some other views on that. But, as you know, I'm not a doctor, and I need to respect that there's certain edges of things that I don't want to talk about on the radio.
Fair enough. Okay, so so we've got this epidemic. You believe through your investigation it's based on this contaminated monkey virus that is in millions of doses. And now you're saying they finally pulled it off the shelf, or what happened?
They pulled the first one off the shelf. That was the Salk vaccine. Then they came back in 1956, 57 with the Sabin vaccine. And that is the one that got the bulk of the distribution. Most of that 200 million doses was Sabin's vaccine. And it was
that was contaminated.
Yes, but they didn't realize it until they had already released 100 million doses.
Oh, my God.
Now, at that point, they got to say, put yourself in their shoes. What do you do? Well, the first thing you do is you say, this is now a national security secret, and nobody's allowed to talk about it because I don't want somebody chopping off my head, all right? The second thing you do is you say, let's get busy trying to figure out a solution. Now, what would be the solution? Well, the people involved, the people who discovered this are Sarah Stewart and Bernice Eddy, and we know from that Time magazine article that they believed that a vaccine was possible. Now, when you're looking at polio, you got heavy, medium, and light, but you're looking at SV40 here, the virus that contaminated the polio vaccine. They only got one flavor of it, and it's bad. So if they can get that virus to mutate into a weaker form, then they can use that weaker form, just like Sabin did, as a vaccine. So how do you get a virus to mutate? How do you mutate something? Well, why don't we use radiation? We got this nice machine here called a linear particle accelerator. and it will create a beam of radiation that we can just turn the dial and control the wavelength and strength of, and we're going to set this facility up. We don't want this up here in Bethesda because we don't want everybody poking their nose around on it. We're going to put this way down in New Orleans because we want it close to Dr. Ochsner, who is president of the American Cancer Society, and he's the guy that lost his grandson to the polio vaccine, and we want him to supervise this project. And so we're going to build this facility. We're going to set this facility up 1/2 a mile from his personal residence.
And is that the one that Mary Stuart Sherman was working at?
Yes.
Okay.
That's where, in my opinion, that's where her arm got blown off.
All right. Okay. So they bombard this mutated virus. They mutate it. What happens to it?
Well, time frame, we're now in 1960-61, and I've tracked down people from Army bioweapons who are, working within 1 mile of the facility and stuff like this. They're trying to do this for the purpose of creating an anti-cancer vaccine, but right at that time, what happens? Fidel Castro takes over Cuba and moves Russian nuclear missiles into Cuba, and New Orleans is now within the range of the missiles. Now, I grew up in New Orleans, and I can tell you the hysteria of Cold War mentality that was alive and well in the city at the time, because that the embargo that we did on Cuba, which is still in place, cost New Orleans about 25% of its trade, which is like, cutting 25% of cars out of Detroit or something. I mean, it was a big issue to the economy in New Orleans. And the threat of Castro was that he was going to take his revolution to the rest of Latin America and wipe out the rest of our trade. And now he's moving in Russian missiles with a 600-mile range, and we're 450 miles away from them. So, the idea that Castro was a real problem to New Orleans was a very big idea. And what this is going on in the background, meanwhile, they're roasting these monkey viruses with the radiation, and guess what? They're discovering that it's making the cancer more aggressive.
It's not killing it. It's not slowing down. It's becoming out of control, isn't it?
More aggressive. And they said, well, if we promised, the government of the United States promised the Russians that we wouldn't go into Cuba as part of the deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Mm-hmm. So they start looking, and this is very well documented, they started looking for alternative ways to kill Fidel Castro. I mean, we've all heard about the exploding cigars and
yes,
and those things. Well, one of the ways, which is documented in some books about people like Sam Giancana and stuff, is that they were looking for an injectable cancer agent. And this is what's called basically the touchdown play that they wanted to do. And they were going to smuggle this into Cuba and have somebody give it to Castro. I personally think this is kind of a harebrained scheme, but the people at the time were very serious about this. And so they made the decision to weaponize the cancer. And by it continually, they set up a loop of laboratories across New Orleans. And these were all cellularized and secret facilities. And in order to do this, you have to have a lot of mice.
All right, hold on right there, Ed. We're going to come back and get more of this story. Then there's a tie-in with Lee Harvey Oswald and JFK as well. We'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And our special guest tonight, Edward Haslam, Dr. Mary's Monkey. More to come on Coast to Coast AM. And if you're just tuning in, we're with Edward Haslam, his work, Dr. Mary's Monkey. We're talking about the viruses and contamination. Now, you talk about that they decided to weaponize the cancer for a biological weapon. Let's pick that back up, Ed.
Right. We're now at the heart of this story, and this story obviously has a lot of moving parts to it, and it's a lot for a radio interview, but I'm happy to talk about it on the radio. But I did write a 374-page book that's very well documented that supports all this, and that's what Dr. Mary's Monkey is, and you can get it at 1-800-556-2012. Now, the point is, we've talked about the Russian missiles coming into Cuba. We've talked about why they had this linear particle accelerator set up on this secret facility in New Orleans, which is the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital, which is a campus guarded by U.S. Marines. And this is in a building on the back of the campus that nobody really has a need to go to. And it's labeled the Infectious Disease Laboratory, just to keep out the casual traffic. And that is where they're doing the radiation. But what they are doing is they're taking these viruses and they're injecting them into mice to grow tumors. And this is a very common medical research practice. Mm-hmm. But it takes a lot of mice. And so they have to set up a facility where they've got 2,000 mice in cages. And because this is secret work, this is buried in a safe house in New Orleans. And one of the things I found was the location of this safe house, which just happened to be across the street from the residence of David Ferry, who was arrested by District Attorney Jim Garrison.
That's right.
Within 48 hours of the Kennedy assassination. And when his investigators went through Ferry's apartment, they found a treatise on using cancer-causing viruses to induce cancer. That was found in Ferry's apartment. It's in the National Archives today. I have a copy of that treatise in my book. Okay, it is very real, but David Ferry did not write it. That treatise was developed up at the National Cancer Institute, probably by Sarah Stewart, for reasons I explained in the book. So what they're doing is they set up this facility where the mice live. They've got a facility across the street at David Ferry's apartment where they take the mice, kill them, cut out the tumors, grind them up in a blender, make some microscope slides, put them back in the test tubes. They take all this back to a doctor to review. Then they take it all back to the U.S. Public Health Service for another round of radiation that ratchets up the lethality of the virus.
More. Okay.
And they do this as a loop. Now, in order to do this, you've got to have someone to handle the cancer-causing viruses. This is very technical and very dangerous work. And you don't really want somebody well-known to do this. You want somebody that's untraceable to do it, because if you get caught, you want to say, oh, that's ridiculous. They couldn't be doing that. And they actually have this girl in Florida who's very interesting, because when she was junior high school, she watched her grandmother die of cancer. And she decided to dedicate her life to finding a cure.
Okay.
And in high school, she starts doing her own cancer experiments. The thing is, she's got support from really sophisticated people in this. And by the time she's a senior in high school, she is giving cancer to mice in 7 days. This is faster than they're able to do it at the National Cancer Institute.
Was she a girl genius?
I think you'd have to. She was certainly dedicated, and she's very, very bright. People use terms like that for those kind of people. So,
yeah.
But the point is, just luck and fate. The American Cancer Society turns out to have a meeting in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is the next town over from where this gal lives, and she goes and crashes the party and meets the VP of research for the American Cancer Society and shows him her research. And they now realize that they have a teenage girl working in a dirt floor laboratory in a high school that's outperforming the National Cancer Institute.
With no budget.
Yes. And they say, honey, you're coming with us. But before they do, this doctor in St. Petersburg, who's really from somewhere else, he's from New York, and he used to be the dean of the medical school at the University of Minnesota. His name is Deal. He picks up the phone and he calls his buddy Alton Ochsner, former president of the American Cancer Society, said, Alton, you got to get down here. I want to introduce you to this girl. And Ochsner goes down there and brings the third guy with him, and the three of them go with Judy back to her high school and look at her laboratory, and they say, "Oh, this is really amazing." And this part is in Judy's new book, not in Dr. Mary's Monkey, but it's all connected. They say, "We got two things to tell you. One is we're shutting down your laboratory today." You got no idea how dangerous this is. And
right. So they had the grounds to do that.
Yes, and you're dealing with immensely powerful people like the president of the American Cancer Society and his buddy that he brought along with him, who was Harold Urey, who was in charge of the Manhattan Project during World War II.
God, so they had some heavy hitters here.
Heavy hitters, and they say, this is so dangerous, you can't even believe what you're doing. You're playing with fire. We're shutting it down, but you, young lady, are coming with us, basically. I mean, we're going to train you because we see you as a weapon in the war against cancer. And they set her up to go up to Buffalo, New York, to the Roswell Park Cancer Institute up there, where she is trained to handle cancer-causing monkey viruses. At this point, you realize that the leadership of the cancer establishment are all aware of the contamination of the polio vaccine. And they got some real serious questions about it. And they like the fact that they have this girl prodigy who is capable of doing all this advanced and sophisticated research that does not have any degrees, is even a minor at this time, and nobody knows who she is. So these guys can conduct research that they don't want to tell anybody they're doing and get the answers to it so they can figure out what's going on with this cancer stuff. And so she's at the University of Florida in 1963, and she gets a phone call from Dr. Oshner in the spring of this, and Oshner says, well, how would you like to skip the last 2 years of medical school? Last 2 years of college and start medical school in the fall. By the way, we'll pay your tuition and give you room and board and a stipend. We just have a little project we need you to do this summer. And by the way, you'll be working under the wing of that hotshot cancer researcher from Chicago that's on my staff, Mary Sherman. Would you like to do this, Judy?
And, of course, Judy jumped at it.
Judy jumped at it. It's her dream job, okay? So on April 19th, 1963, Judy gets on a bus in Gainesville, Florida, and she heads to New Orleans for the summer. And what her job is she is the one that is to kill the mice, cut out the tumors, grind them up, prepare the test tubes and the slides, and do all this in a clean sort of situation, but all in secret. And this work is all done in the kitchen of David Ferry.
In his kitchen?
In his kitchen.
Now, is she still convinced that she's trying to cure cancer and do something for the good of mankind?
Well, for the good of mankind. See, when she gets there, she gets informed that Castro has these nuclear missiles, and he's trying to start World War III. Here are the chemicals and all this stuff. She is being supported by the most powerful people in the country in this, and by the military. And she's an asset. I mean, just like they say in the intelligence business, she's an asset. And she's now in New Orleans. They find her an apartment. They give her a cover job. And while she's on the clock at the cover job, 2 afternoons a week, she goes over to the secret laboratory to do this cancer work. And there's three things you can say about this gal. First of all, she's brilliant. Secondly, she's beautiful because we got photos of her. And thirdly, she gets lost going around the corner. I mean, she's 19 years old, and she's naive, and she's from a small town in Florida, and she's in big, bad, sin-sick New Orleans. So what does she need? A babysitter, a bodyguard, somebody to make sure that she gets to where she's going, that here's the cover job. So they set her up with this ex-Marine.
Oh, no.
Who's at her elbow, who works with her at the Riley Coffee Company, and the name of the ex-Marine is Lee Oswald.
You've got to be kidding.
No, I'm not. I'm saying this is what is unknown about Oswald, and And when you realize this, you realize they're not going to let this guy get into a courtroom and start talking.
This is bizarre. Okay, so Oswald is her bodyguard, basically.
Essentially. Her escort, yeah.
Now, at that point,
they both live along. Oswald gets her an apartment, okay, right off of Magazine Street. Oswald lives on Magazine Street, and the Magazine bus goes from Oswald's house, picks up Judy, and drops them off in front of the Riley Coffee Company where they both work. Now, William Riley is probably the biggest anti-communist in New Orleans. Why? Because he imports coffee from South America. And if this communist revolution gets into these countries that he buys his coffee from, he's going to lose his free labor, you know?
Right.
It's a real threat to him. And the other guy that's the biggest anti-communist in New Orleans at the time is this Dr. Alton Ochsner. And Ochsner sets up this organization called the Information Council for the Americas, or INCA for short. And Riley is one of the founding members of this and one of the main financial contributors to it, as are some other very interesting people like Farley from California, who owns Schick and Technicolor and stuff. And so you've got some very powerful people financing this political action group in New Orleans, which is founded and organized by a doctor. Now, I get involved with all this, and I wound up going down to New Orleans in 1993, I think it was, because I had seen something really strange back in the 80s. Somebody had shown me some files that they said were secret files, and they wanted me to do some work on them. Well, these files, I was told in 1982, belonged to Guy Bannister. Who
all right,
was,
and he was also down in New Orleans at the time.
Yeah, well,
right?
he's the former head of the FBI in Chicago, who everyone who studies this says is running Oswald. He's Oswald's boss in New Orleans.
He had a little office up there and everything.
And so I'm shown these files, and I wind up working with somebody who's investigating this for PBS, and we go down there and we find the files, thanks to a lead from Jim DiEugenio, in Inca. Okay, Bannister's files are in Inca. Okay, now you get the masthead of Inca, and you look at all the names on the masthead, and you find really interesting things, like the guy that's the head of security for Inca is the president of the retired special agents of the FBI. And then you discover over at Riley Coffee Company that the guy that Judy's working for, her boss, is an ex-FBI agent. And this guy knows all about Oswald. But he testifies to the Warren Commission, gives them information on Oswald and stuff, never mentions the fact that his secretary showed up at the front door of the coffee company day after day after day with Oswald at her elbow.
All right, so all this is going on. Let's jump ahead a little bit. She's working with Mary Sherman, the doctor, and then Mary gets electrocuted, right?
Yeah, Mary's part of this underground medical laboratory, and after Judy gets the mice tumors ground up, she puts them in a thing, and it's a short bus ride over to Mary Sherman's apartment. She brings them over to Mary Sherman for her to look at. Mary's got a microscope and stuff in her apartment, and she's got access to an electron microscope through Ochsner in uptown New Orleans. And so she's doing the serious science study on this, and she's the one who's taking these vials of cancer-causing monkey viruses back to the U.S. Public Health Service hospital and re-exposing them to the next round of radiation, which is why she's in contact with this machine that blows off her arm.
Okay, now, what does this Judy do at this point when Mary dies?
Well, Mary dies in 1964. That's after the assassination.
Okay.
What happens this summer is that they're working on this biological weapon, and it's killing the mice like crazy. And they say, well, let's take it up the ladder. Let's inject it into monkeys. And it starts killing the monkeys. And they say, well, that's great. We're getting real close here. All we got to do is find out if this will kill a human, like a Cuban.
So they're really not too concerned about eradicating cancer. They're more concerned at this point with making a little weapon.
That's right.
Okay.
An untraceable weapon, because the public has been told viruses can't cause cancer.
Right.
So what a great weapon to have. I mean, you imagine you've got a witness in a jail, and he knows something that you don't want him to tell the court, and you can get him to die of cancer suddenly.
Is this a fast-spreading cancer, Ed?
28 days.
28 days, you're gone.
Yep.
Okay.
And they know this number because they set up an experiment to test it on humans. We're talking about lethal experiments where the objective of the test is to kill the human. Okay? And they set this up in the mental hospital in Jackson, Louisiana. And they bring prisoners over from Angola, which is the infamous penitentiary up there in Louisiana. And these are, quote, supposed to be volunteers. And they bring them over there. They inject them with the stuff, and they watch them die. And when Judy realizes that, her dream was to cure cancer. I mean, her motive was her dead grandmother. She's not in this to kill humans. And when she realizes that what she has gotten herself into, she protests and she bolts, okay? And at that point in time, they tell her, they say, first of all, you're lucky to be alive. And if you open your mouth, you won't be.
So now she sees a different face.
You're now out of medicine.
Yeah, she sees a different face with these people, doesn't she?
That's right, but they tell her she's out of medicine. And so what you've got is this girl who's got, newspaper article after newspaper article, all these correspondences, all this documentation that she is the brain that's going to cure cancer. And she's doing all this stuff, and all of a sudden she hits New Orleans in 1963, and she never does anything in science again. What happened?
What happened? Is she alive now?
Yeah, she is.
Are you in touch with her still?
Yeah. Yeah, I do emails with her all the time. She's out in cyberspace in Europe somewhere.
What happened with Oswald at that point?
Oswald is very aware that he's being manipulated, and by the end of the summer realizes that they're going after Kennedy and they're going to set him up because all this stuff is that he's being asked to do in New Orleans is painting him as a fanatic.
Okay, what I want to do, Ed, when we come back in just a moment is now tie in JFK to all of this and how it happens and why it happens. This is a remarkable story. Ed's book, Dr. Mary's Monkey. We'll get you that toll-free number again when we come back. It is available out there at Amazon.com as well. We'll be back.